You guys already know Japan, a smaller country on the eastern side of Asia that seems like it doesn't bother anybody. But this is not the same Japan that wanted to own the entire world in World War II. In the worst case possible, they would enslave the people around them. Like in Korea, they made the men their slaves and the women sex slaves. And Korea always asks for them to apologize, but the Japanese never do. But we're just passing by Korea. The main focus is China. If you've seen our video about Unit 731 of Japan, you know what the Japanese did to the Chinese. But in this clip, we're gonna look at another side of the cruelty the Japanese did, the Nanjing Massacre. You have to know that in the 1930s, China's capital was Nanjing. In the December of 1937, the Japanese attacked Nanjing. After Japan got Nanjing, basically the entire country was in Japanese hands. When the Japanese conquered, there was 4,000 Chinese soldiers left. But the Japanese didn't want to feed them, give them a place to stay like a prison. And that is why on the same day, they killed every single one of them. The Japanese really hated the other Asians except themselves. They believed the best Asian is the Japanese, and the Koreans, Chinese, Filipinos, all are disgusting. And the Japanese soldiers were people that were taught this all throughout their early childhood, that Japanese is superior and everyone else stinks. Like we said, China was in Japanese hands, but obviously they were against them. And that is why the Japanese want to set an example in a way so nobody stays in front of them. And that is why they choose Nanjing to set this example. When the Japanese soldiers would walk around people in Nanjing, the people would shake. One of those days, 2 Japanese soldiers made a bet, and they told the reporter to be the witness. They said, "We made a bet to cut Chinese heads off, and whoever reaches 100 heads is the winner." They started cutting normal people heads off, and the reporter counts it. This is not a story, this happened for real. These 2 soldiers you're seeing cut more than 200 Chinese heads off, and the one on the left was the winner. It seems like the Mongols got a bad rap, because when you read about the Japanese back then, they're pretty similar. The 200 heads these guys cut is a small portion of the story. When they got the city, they would walk on the streets, kill people, rape the young girls, and then kill them, kill the kids, and then they would set fire to any building. When they had a huge population and they didn't want the city to be piled with bodies, they would make everybody walk towards the river. Then they would kill them with a bullet and throw them in the river. Each officer would kill their own herd a different way. Like you see an officer have 300 to 400 people around him and he sets them on fire. Another officer would kill him with bullets, another one with a sword. Every officer would make an area and they would take the crowd over there, a place where there's guards all around. They would put him there except the young women. They would rape the young women, then put them in the area. At that time, the Nazis and the Japanese were allies, and in Nanjing, there was German reporters. One of the German reporters say that they collect all the young Chinese girls, and when there's more than 1,000 of them, they rape each one, and then they would kill them. They also wrote that in this city, you could not sleep at night, because until the morning, you hear screams. The Germans said we couldn't tell them anything. We couldn't even ask them why. If we said anything, we would be joining the Chinese. In the news, they wrote 20,000 Chinese women were raped, but the Chinese say this is 100% false. The real number is more than 100,000 women. History Channel says about 80,000 women were raped. Either way, nobody has the actual statistic. The Japanese continued the killing for 6 weeks, and when they saw the frightened faces of the Chinese, they kind of stopped. Some people believe in this 6 weeks, 300,000 people died. But others say this number is a joke. They believe if not 1 million people died, about 800,000 people were killed. You have to know that all these people that were murdered were normal people in the city, not soldiers. There is no real statistics because they threw the body in the river, they burned them, or after 6 weeks, the Chinese themselves came and buried them. Either way, China until 1945, meaning the day where the atom bombs were dropped, was being ran over by the Japanese army. They would kill, rape, burn, and enslave. After the war was over, all the Japanese officers were responsible for this were arrested, and a few of them were executed. But the main one, not only did they not go to trial, they also gave them medals. It seems like the Chinese location is very unlucky because the Mongols took over, and that is why they built the Great Wall of China. But the Mongols were still able to get through and take over. And on the other side, we got the Japanese. Anything bad, they did it to the Chinese. The Nanjing Massacre and Unit 731 is one of the most brutal things to happen in the 20th century. But a lot of people don't know about them. Like, almost everybody knows about the Holocaust, but they haven't heard of this massacre. And you know what's sad? The Japanese don't accept it. They also don't feel bad about Unit 731. They say all these stories were made by Westerners and the Chinese. But the Japanese were very racist back then, and they believed their race was the best, and they believed all the other races were below them. After World War II, Germany apologized for what the Nazis did to the world, but the Japanese believe they don't have to apologize. Not only did they not apologize for the Unit 731, they look at the people that did all that with pride. And they also gave medals to the officers that were responsible for the Nanjing Massacre, and some of those officers were executed just for show. We all know that war is a bad thing, and when a war starts, there's always bad things that come with it. Some things happen that when you compare them to the war is nothing. If you see the video about Joseph Mengele, it's one of those things. A disaster that happened in World War II. A war that changed the world. It wasn't only the Nazis. In the same war, there was a place on the other side of the world. Japan's Unit 731. In World War II, Japan was a superpower, and it controlled the eastern part of Asia. Japan was part of the Axis powers that fought the Allies. In that time, east of China, Philippines, Korea, and parts of Russia were in Japan's hands. So in that time, the eastern part of China was in Japan's hand. And Unit 731 was in today's China. Unit 731 was kind of like a laboratory, and they did chemical and biological testing. If you visit laboratories all around the world, in all of those labs, all the testing is done on mice. But in Unit 731, exactly like Auschwitz, the experiments were all done on humans. You have to know that Unit 731 was pretty much a prison that had laboratories, and in a span of 5 years, meaning from 1940 to 1945, 400,000 people were killed. But between these 400,000 people, 3,000 people were chosen to be experimented on. Most of these people were Chinese, and there were some Koreans, Mongols, and Russians. We are not sure how they picked the people, and why these 3,000 people were chosen from the other ones. One of the experiments was experimenting in the cold, an experiment Joseph Mengele was trying at the same time, because the biggest problem for the soldiers at that time were the cold, and they wanted to figure out a way to help the soldiers survive in the winter. Outside of this prison was extremely cold. They would walk the person outside and they would hold him until he starts freezing, and you start seeing frostbite. When he got to that point, they would bring him inside, so the doctors can run experiments on the body. The people that were released from this prison would explain they would take the people outside in the freezing cold, and since they wanted them to freeze faster, they would pour freezing water on top of them. And when they were freezing, one of the soldiers would have a stick, and then he would proceed to hit the prisoner with it. And the reason for that was, if it made a louder noise than a human body, it's time to go inside. The person that they would take inside was pretty much dead, but they wanted to try other things to bring him back to life and figure out how you can make a person unfreeze. They tried all types of experiments on these freezing prisoners. Sometimes they would pour warm water on top of them. There was also boiling water used on top of them as well. Some of these people would be chosen to get a disease. They would inject some things to force them to get sick. When they would get sick, they would go to the surgery room. Without any anesthesia or painkillers, they would open up the patient. They just wanted to know what this disease does inside the body. When they open up the person's body, they would most likely die from pain. Another test they did in Unit 731 was testing sicknesses. For this test, they needed a bunch of people to have this sickness, and that is why the people inside the prison weren't enough for this experiment. They would make disease-filled liquids, put them in planes, and go spray on type of Chinese towns. Then they would look at the town and see what's going on. They would see what this sickness is doing, and sometimes they would even take some subjects from the town to Unit 731. The reason they did this was to see if it's worth it to try bigger cities, and to try it on their biggest enemies, mostly the United States. They wanted to put disease-filled liquid inside of balloons and fly it over the United States. But let's get back to Unit 731. Japanese people have this attitude that everything has to be well done, and that is why they wanted to make the best weapons as well. And for testing these weapons, they would use these poor prisoners. They would use different types of weapons in different ranges to see which one is more effective. They would test different grenades from different distances as well. They would release gas on prisoners as well to see which one is more deadly. They wanted to see from what distance this gas is deadly. Or they wanted to see what a human does inside a pressure chamber. They would put people inside pressure chambers, and when they go in there, in the first couple seconds, their eyes would pop out. Then they would die. The interesting part is, some of the colleges that had medical students would send these students to Unit 731 to do tests on human subjects. One of the students came clean about this place. They told them, if you want to get a medical degree, you have to go to China and do tests on humans. They would give some people syphilis, and then they would bring another prisoner and make them have sex. They wanted to see how syphilis is transferred. They would bring a man with syphilis and have a woman right there as well, and they would make him make the female pregnant. And the reason was they wanted to see if the baby comes out with syphilis. A lot of babies were born in this laboratory, but no babies left here alive. Because when a baby was born, they for sure had experiments for them. Experiments that explaining them is disturbing. Japan themselves later confessed that they did more experiments than people knew. The things we told you in the beginning, they didn't deny any of them. And they added 4 more things they did over there. One of the tests were exposing people to radiation, meaning they would send radioactive waves to see what happens. Another experiment was that they would replace human blood with animal blood, and they wanted to see what happens to the person. Another one, they would put salty seawater inside a human body. And last but not least, they said they would burn people alive to see what happens. Can you believe it? How bad some people are? There's a reason that Chinese people and Koreans are still mad at Japan, and they ask them to apologize for what they did. The Germans apologized for everything the Nazis did, but the Japanese haven't apologized to anybody. Even to the Chinese, which they did the most damage to. And worst of all, they acknowledge the people that did all this, and look at them as heroes.